All right, so thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me. This is my first time speaking in front of live people for a very long time, so it feels very special. Today's May 12th, 2023. So thank you all for coming here, those of you here today. For those of you watching in the future, all praise be to our artificial intelligence overlords. So I'm going to talk about, what's going on there, that screen? I'm going to be talking about my experiences teaching with Jupyter, IPython notebooks originally. I'll start off just, wait a minute, I got to stay here for the camera, don't I? A cognitive model, just of how I have come to learn to think about teaching over the last 30 years. I was originally an applied mathematician and computer scientist teaching at universities, and then about 8 years ago I left to go into industry, and I worked first at Anaconda and now at Quantsite. I'll mention a little bit about tooling, tools that I use, and I'll try and talk also about some of the different contexts in which I've been teaching recently. As a quick disclaimer, I work for Quantsite, and so when I talk about one of the open source projects that we do, and I'm very excited. Of course, I have friends and colleagues working on this. Actually, the same thing will happen when I talk about Anaconda as well, because I used to work with them, and I still have very good friends and colleagues there. So the general way that I want to start is from this kind of cartoon of sort of the way our brains work, right? So we have long-term memory and we have short-term memory. And this is something I learned from doing training for Software Carpentry, instructor training, and it has influenced the way that I think about teaching and learning. Basically, learning is about finding ways to transfer things from short-term memory into long-term memory, right? And so our short-term memory is influenced by sensory input from various channels, auditory, visual, verbal, and such. And we integrate those together, and through that integration, that information will get encoded and then go into our long-term memory. So teaching and learning is really about finding strategies, constructing experiences in order to optimize that kind of transfer. So the reason I want to mention this is because this relates to an idea called cognitive load. Right? So when you're trying to create learning experiences and interventions, one of the things that you'll do is you'll have load that is associated with the learning task with what it is you're trying to teach. You'll have effort that's associated. Associated with that the learning task, there may be some germane knowledge, some germane cognitive load that's associated with maybe some prerequisite knowledge and some related concepts that are tied in. And everything else that is associated with that is you think of as extrinsic or irrelevant extra effort. So the reason I mention this is that when we're designing lessons and when we're designing teaching content, what we really need to do is to identify and eliminate as much extrinsic load as possible. And to be judicious in choosing tools, oh my goodness, to work with learners, and so that it gets out of the way and doesn't interfere so much with the learning. So as an example of this, let me just quickly, I'll pop over. Here I've got sort of a classic Jupyter notebook interface. And so I'm using here Rise, which is, this can actually become a set of slides, Reveal.js, and so this is just an example that we have for illustrating a kind of a data frame workflow with Dask and Pandas, of course, and actually I think one of the previous speakers was using this as well, right? So you can execute Jupyter Notebook cells just as usual, and you can reveal them one by one. And I kind of like to do things in this way because it allows me to limit this extrinsic load, right? And to piece things out not be scrolling through notebooks all the time in live presentations like this, right? And this is also encouraging here, trying to use some best practices from a scientific computing perspective, right? If I'm importing files and doing things like that, I want to try and use identifiers so that if the paths and things change later on, I don't have to worry about that anywhere other than the first cell of my notebook, right? So, one of the things about Jupyter Notebooks that makes them really useful is that they're interactive, right? So, and in particular, one of the tricks that I think I actually saw John use this in his talk yesterday is that, of course, you can use tooltips, right? So, if this is something I'm always make a point of showing. Where if you've got a function or a method, if you insert the cursor inside the parentheses next to the identifier for the function or the method, and you hit Shift-Tab, you get a tooltip that then reminds you of all of the keyword arguments and the documentation associated with the function. So of course, Pandas read CSV has about 50 different keyword arguments. There's no way you're going to remember that, right? That's extremely extrinsic load. But here what I want to do is I want to say, okay, well, I want to use, if I'd scrolled through that, I would have found out that parse dates is the argument I want. And I want to, put in a specific column there. And so I can go and do that. Again, the other thing about Rise, it's nice, is you do this Reveal.js presentation, and you're able to edit the code interactively, and this works very nicely for live presentations like this, and also for recorded screencasts. I'll talk about that more in a little bit. I think I've actually kind of, we can, let me just pd.df.tail, right? Right, so we can actually then, whoops, I've got the name backwards. Let's go pd. Right, and then we can play around and do various things. I'm not going to go through. Of course, we can use the tab completion as well to discover things as well, right? So I want to look at the D types here. So this is the kind of thing that I would make a point of sort of encouraging people to look at while we're doing this stuff. A lot of this advice, of course, I discovered this a few weeks ago while I was preparing this talk and found out that Lorena Barber organized a workshop where a bunch of about over a dozen very clever people put together a lot of notes on teaching and learning with Jupyter and produced a handbook that's really very good. And I thought, oh no, I've gone and rediscovered all of this stuff that they already knew. And on the one hand, I think that's a good thing, right? That actually so many people independently have over the past year, this is a bit of a retrospective talk. There's a lot of stuff that very clever people have learned about teaching with Jupyter, and some of that is reflected in here. A large number of these people are academics, so I'm now a recovering academic. So I will try and bring a little bit of different perspective into that as I go forward. So let me talk now about tooling. Of course, so this is a recent social media post from a colleague of mine, Ethan White, who I knew from Software Carpentry days. Before I left academia, I was very heavily involved with Software Carpentry, which is one of the things that helped me make my decision to leave in some sense. And around 2012, as Ethan says here, the process of installing to start a workshop, one of the boot camps, was just painful. Usually the first hour of us was spent sort of going around troubleshooting, trying to get people's installed, particularly on Windows machines, because Python was a real pain to do. And it was enormously distracting to teaching and training. And I will say, even as recently, when I started at Continuum Analytics and Anaconda in training, there were occasions when me and members of my team had this similar experience, sometimes in corporate training, just because this installation problem was still very hard, and dealing with corporate firewalls and other kinds of issues that could arise. So today, sensible solutions exist, but it just is worthwhile, remembering Ethan's toot here, because it took a long time to reach here, and this is something we can all be a bit proud of. So as I said, I'm going to sing the praises of my co-workers and Anaconda, my former co-workers and friends there, because I think Anaconda made a huge difference towards solving this Python install problem, and in fact, generalized this to many beyond there, right? The Anaconda distribution, by default, would give you a lot of really useful tools that you can use in Python. But of course, Conda, the package manager, also allows you to manage environments, so you can have different versions of things living concurrently on the same machine. And of course, also the solution that was found was also just as IPython notebooks generalized to Jupyter, when it was realized that actually the approach taken was not strictly about Python. It is actually, you could use R and Julia and other kind of languages. You could also use Conda for package management in other tools as well. So that was a really big step towards helping get the tooling out of the way so that when we're doing training and when we're doing teaching, in whether or not in academic or industrial contexts, we can make meaningful progress. More recently at Quansight, my colleagues have been developing a system called Nabari for Jupyter Hub deployment in the cloud and simplify. So I typically now when I do training, the last few years, I'm always using Nabari for training, and all of the install problems have, and that painful experience has gone away. Essentially what happens is I will design a Conda environment. I'll put together some notebooks, and then I'll get one of the engineers to help me set up the Nabari instance. And then from the point of view of the learners, basically I'll create some accounts, and they log in and they select an instance profile. They wait a minute or two, it's booted up, then a Jupyter Hub arises using a Jupyter lab environment, I guess typically. And if I've done things, I can set things up so that the Conda environments are there, the data is there, the notebooks are there, and a lot of the things we can get up and running within a few minutes without any real hassle. So that's a really great progress that has really only been a few years in some sense, but it's I mean, of course, there are other solutions. I know that of course a lot of people use Binder and other technologies. But I want to emphasize, right, it's actually really beneficial to do the cloud-based solution for training and teaching so that you're not overwhelming the learners right off the bat. That does postpone a problem, then there is still a post-install problem. You know, if they want to actually put stuff on their own machines, they need to figure that out later on. And that's something that maybe there are other tools that we can look at. Actually, one thing that does help is Anaconda Project. So following on from one of the speakers yesterday, Julia Vargaman had 5 tips for creating a reusable Jupyter notebooks for teaching. And one of the points she raised was aiming for reproducibility. And I think that Anaconda Project is a really good tool. Again, it's an open source tool developed in Anaconda. It may get folded into as Conda Project at some point. I'm not entirely sure of the current development plans. But the really nice thing about it is it bundles in environment creation, data preparation, and the setup into a standard form. So in theory, if you've set everything up correctly and you bundle things in, you create what's called an Anaconda Project YAML file that outlines the creation of the environment, the setup of any environment variables, downloads of any data. And you can type Anaconda Project run, and it should just work. So this is a sort of a little GIF that shows a simple notebook being launched, all from one command line command. Another really useful tool that was really critical in the software carpentry days when I was starting out was the Etherpad. Nowadays, people would just use a Google Doc. It has a similar functionality. It's a shared collaborative editing environment. But 10 odd years ago, when I was doing these workshops, what I would do is we would have an Etherpad instance. I'd share a URL on the whiteboard at the front of the room for the learners. And then we all have a web page where we can share text collaboratively. So it's very good for sort of sharing notes and for interactions with all of the people. But as an instructor with the students, another thing that's really good for is actually if you have stuff that you're typing, right? If you've got a URL or a shell command or a couple of lines of code, you sometimes, when I've delivered tutorials, I'm typing things up and trying to get people to follow along. And if I go ahead too fast, they get frustrated, or they make typos trying to look up at the screen and copy it. If you just paste it into an Etherpad or a Google Doc or some shared doc, then of course that problem goes away, and you can still keep moving forward. When I do remote training nowadays, I do that usually with a Zoom chat or the chat feature of whatever the video conferencing system is. Of course, one thing to be aware of is in a lot of corporate environments now, there may be a Google Doc that all of the learners are collaborating on, but me as the instructor may not have access to that. So that can be a bit of a nuisance. Finally, I'll come back to Rise. So I already did a little demo of that, and I think the previous speaker was using it as well. This is an example of a video that we recorded for one of our clients. So everything is nice and big, and it looks very, for the screencast is, I don't usually speak that quickly, but maybe you're disagreeing listening to me now. This is a really nice way of putting it together. Again, the only thing is it does require that you use the classic Jupyter notebook interface. Jupyter Lab is something I use more when I know that everyone is following along with me. It's kind of a nicer environment, I find, for that. So finally, let me just wrap up talking a little bit about some of the contexts I've been teaching in. And of course, this is not necessarily Jupyter specific. I think on the left there is the university I used to teach at in Ontario. There's a sample classroom there of undergrads looking very earnest. And a corporate training environment, of course, is a little bit more. We have what we call free-range learners. I'm not sure I like that metaphor because it makes the alternative sound like battery hens, which is maybe not the right way to think of it. But I think one of the things that I learned in doing these, first these software carpentry bootcamps and then later corporate training, is I learned to appreciate much more the idea of prerequisites when I was a university professor. And everyone came into the room, and there would be, I knew they had taken prerequisite courses. I knew what they knew beforehand. Whereas in a class of free-range learners, you can have a lot of troubles with getting things at the right level because you have people that have been just hired, or maybe people who've been there 15 years, and trying to pitch things correctly can be a real challenge. The format is also something that that needs a bit of work to adjust to. And also, of course, managing the expectations in terms of what exactly is going to happen requires a bit more nuance in sort of corporate and industry training environments. With remote training, I often have a two-screen environment. So I've got here, again, I've got sped up. I'm using Jupyter Lab. This is recorded on a Google Meet I had probably with a class that I was teaching a few months ago. So I've got two screens where I'm looking at my video conferencing software and at my Jupyter notebook. But I don't know whether or not that's the same for the learners as well, which is very different than if they're looking at their own screen and they're looking up at the projected screen in a classroom. And I can also wander around and take a look and troubleshoot, which is a little harder to do if I have to do screen share on a remote training session. But I think a lot of us have all had to learn painfully about remote training in the last few years. I'll just go quickly through some of these last mitigating factors. I think, as I mentioned already, size and variety of backgrounds in learner cohorts is an issue that you have to deal with a lot in outside of academic environments. But there's also a lot of IT concerns that you have to get through as well, right? Are there privacy laws? Banks and insurance companies and medical companies have to be very restrictive about the kinds of data that can move around, the kinds of software that can move around, the firewalls. There's a lot of vetting of approved software can be quite a hassle. So those are things that really need to be sort of negotiated very carefully and navigated carefully in those kinds of environments. So Just let me quickly summarize then. So I think one of the big things I want to say is to make sure that you decouple the sources of difficulty. I think we've seen a lot of talks, of great talks in the last few days of describing how stuff is, these Jupyter hubs are deployed in education in various contexts. But I think you've got issues about data code distribution and environments and the setup. And if you can kind of separate those from some of the other concerns, if you can use think tools like Binder and some of these other things right now, that's really great. I think also when designing thinking this model of cognitive load, I think is actually really important, right? So you can think about your teaching goals and focusing on what is appropriate for your actual audience. And also to remember with Jupyter, the key thing is interactivity. As John said yesterday, a lot of the thing you really want to have is you want to have short, low stakes assessments and a lot of spaced repetition in order to help learning, right? And so if you can reduce the cognitive load and focus on the interactivity of Jupyter, that's really the reason why we use it in teaching. So with that, thank you all for your attention. I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, David. It's always surprised me that after 10 years, some of the issues is still similar, the same, like installing software.
Well, no, but actually it's better now. Yeah. It's a lot better now. So
we have time for one, maybe two questions. One. Any questions?
Oh, over there.
Do you have any tips or recommendation on how to evaluate the delivery of a class?
So sorry, do I have any tips on evaluation?
Yeah, not to evaluate your delivery of a class. So when you deliver a class based on notebooks to a lot of students, like how do you know they were successful?
Yeah, so when so the question is when delivering, how do you actually assess success? So typically we do post course evaluations, and so we get a little survey feedback. I think one thing that I've learned in corporate training is the most important thing when you get the most feedback, because we all get so many emails asking us to fill in forms and evaluations. So the most successful strategy to get a high rate of return is to try and do it in like the last 5 minutes of the class, right? While you're actually there in front of people. Say, hey, can you do this? Or just before a coffee break or something like that. Because then you'll, on average, get a higher rate of return. And usually people are pretty honest about and with what they want and what they need. I think, it's a tough question. It's a good question, because I think if you don't get that feedback, it's really hard to know. Did you have a follow-up question? Can you use the notebook of the participant to? That's a good question. That's a good idea. I suppose in principle, if we use something like the Mari, where we've actually got the hub uploaded, we could in principle take a look at that data. That would be a thought, actually. Thank you. That's a great idea.
I have a question, if you don't mind, Nicola. Coming from Brazil, and lots of other people here come from Colombia and other places that sometimes has internet issues or slow connection, installation become a big problem. Every time, if like downloading 40 megabytes will take like a couple of minutes, and using internet connection might not be too reliable because you're getting disconnected. There's any big progress on like running? You show Nepbody.
Yeah.
There is any easy way to install like a Raspberry Pi without too much technical knowledge depth? I'm not sure about Raspberry Pi per se. I would say the issue you're making about bandwidth, my feeling, perhaps incorrect, would be that trying to download things for a local install is probably more punitive for people who are bandwidth limited than trying to log into a remote computer and just doing everything through a web browser. So I would say for the purpose of getting up and running quickly,
the Binder, Nabari, whatever, Jupyter Hub, remote Jupyter Hub, web-based solution is probably a better way to go for the moment. It doesn't get around the post-install problem. That's still an open problem.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate the inspiration talk.
All right.
Please, a second round of applause for Dhavide.
Thank you.